"Professor, I don't want to be your student anymore." The words hung in the humid air of the mahogany-lined study, vibrating with a frequency that seemed to rattle the very spines of the leather-bound volumes lining the walls of St. Jude's College. Outside, the Oxfordshire rain was a relentless, grey curtain, blurring the sharp Gothic spires of the university into something ghostly and indistinct. Inside, the scent of bergamot tea and old vellum was suffocating. Julian Halloway did not look up immediately. He remained poised over the essay Elara Thorne had submitted 3 days prior, his fountain pen a vintage Parker, with a nib that scratched like a judgmental claw hovering over a particularly dense paragraph on Miltonic verse. The silence stretched, measured by the rhythmic, heavy tick of the grandfather clock in the corner, a sound that Elara felt in the marrow of her bones. It was a pulse that reminded her of every second she had spent in this room over the last 3 years, tethered to the role of the acolyte, the vessel waiting to be filled. A curious opening gambit for a Tuesday afternoon tutorial, Miss Thorne, Julian finally said. His voice was a rich, low baritone, smoothed by decades of academic poise, and the subtle, sharp edges of a man who dealt exclusively in the precision of language. He did not call her Elara. He never did. To him, she was a category, a classification of intellect and potential, a soul to be graded and filed away. "It isn't a gambit," Elara replied, her voice steadier than she felt. She watched the way the light from the desk lamp caught the silver at his temples. He was 44, exactly 20 years her senior, a distance that had once felt like an insurmountable mountain range. Now, it felt like a thin, transparent veil she was ready to tear through. "It's a resignation." Julian finally laid the pen down. The click of the cap was final. A small punctuation marked the grand narrative of their history. He leaned back, his grey eyes narrowing behind thin-rimmed spectacles. He looked at her not as a professor looks at a pupil, but as a philologist looks at a dead language that has suddenly, impossibly, spoken a new word. "The term is not yet over," he observed, his tone maddeningly clinical. "You have your finals in 6 weeks. Your dissertation on the Romantic poets is, while occasionally prone to fits of excessive sentimentality, the most promising work this department has seen in a decade. To withdraw now would be an act of intellectual sabotage." "I'm not withdrawing from the university, Julian." The use of his Christian name was a physical blow. She saw the microscopic flinch in the corner of his eye, the tightening of his jaw. The barrier had been breached. The ivory tower was under siege. "I am withdrawing from the dynamic," she continued, her internal monologue a roaring gale that she struggled to distill into calm sentences. She thought of the hundreds of hours spent sitting in the velvet armchair opposite him, her mind a frantic mirror, trying to reflect his brilliance. She thought of the way she had curated her thoughts to please him, the way she had tucked away her own wild, unformed theories, because they didn't fit the rigid architecture of his logic. She was tired of being the moon to his sun, a cold rock only visible when he chose to shine upon her. "The dynamic is that of master and scholar," Julian said, his voice dropping an octave. He stood up, a slow, predatory movement that reminded her he was not just a collection of books and theories, but a man of flesh and bone. He walked to the window, looking out at the rain-slicked cobbles of the quad. "It is an ancient, sacred structure. It requires a certain distance, a preservation of the hierarchy to ensure the purity of the transmission of knowledge." Purity. Elara let out a short, sharp laugh that tasted like copper. "There is nothing pure about it. It's a cage. You've spent 3 years teaching me how to think like you, how to speak like you, how to see the world through the narrow aperture of your cynicism, and in doing so, you've made it impossible for me to be anything else while I'm in your presence. I don't want to be your student because I can't breathe in the shadow of your expectations anymore." She watched his reflection in the dark glass of the window. He looked tired. The arrogance was there, yes, but beneath it was a profound, crystalline loneliness. She realized then that he was as much a prisoner of the hierarchy as she was. He was the king of a very small, very dusty kingdom, and his only subject was about to leave. You think I enjoy the pedestal? He asked softly, not turning around. I think you're terrified of coming down from it, Elara said. She stood up too, her legs trembling. The distance between them was barely 6 feet, yet it felt like a chasm, filled with all the things they hadn't said, the lingering glances over the margins of a text, the accidental brush of fingers when exchanging a book, the heavy, unspoken weight of an attraction that had been dressed up in the respectable clothes of academic mentorship. She hated the word mentorship. It was a sterile shroud draped over a bonfire. If you are no longer my student, Julian said, turning slowly to face her, then what are you, Elara? The sound of her name on his lips was a revelation. It wasn't the sharp, clipped Miss Thorne that dismissed her humanity. It was a plea. It was a recognition. I don't know yet, she admitted, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. But I know that as long as I am the student and you are the teacher, we are playing roles in a play written by dead men. You correct my grammar. You tell me where my logic fails. You hold the power of the grade, the reference, the future. That power is a wall. I want to stand on level ground, Julian. I want to know if, when the titles are stripped away, there is anything left of us besides the books. Julian moved then, crossing the room with a suddenness that stole her breath. He stopped just inches from her, the scent of him ink, rain, and something warm like cedar wood filling her senses. He didn't touch her. To touch her would be to break 1,000 years of tradition, to invite the scandal that always hovered at the edges of such intense intellectual unions. But the air between them was electric, a static charge that made the fine hairs on her arms stand up. You have no idea, he whispered, how difficult it has been to keep you at that distance. Elara looked up into his eyes, seeing the cracks in the porcelain. Then why did you? Because I wanted you to be great, he said. And for the first time, his voice broke. I wanted you to have the life I didn't have, the freedom of the mind without the burdens of the heart. I thought if I kept you as a student, I could protect your intellect from the messiness of me. The messiness is where the life is, Julian, she said, reaching out, a hand hovering near his lapel. You taught me about the romantics. You taught me about Keats and the negative capability, the ability to be in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. And yet, you've spent your whole life reaching for the safety of facts. You've used the classroom as a fortress. He looked down at her hand, his breath hitching. The rain outside seemed to intensify, a deluge that threatened to wash away the foundations of the college. If you walk out of this room today and drop my course, Julian said, his voice strained, you will have to find a new supervisor. You will have to explain to the dean why you are changing tutors so close to the end. You will be scrutinized. They will whisper. Let them, Elara said. I would rather be the subject of a whisper than the echo of your voice. A slow, pained smile touched his lips. God, you've become formidable. I suppose I should take the credit for that, shouldn't I? No, Elara said firmly. I became formidable in spite of you. I became formidable by learning how to disagree with you. That was the most important lesson you never intended to teach. The silence returned, but it was different now. It wasn't the heavy, oppressive silence of the tutorial. It was the expectant silence of a threshold. Elara felt a strange, soaring lightness. By voicing the words, she had broken the spell. She was no longer a vessel. She was an entity. So, Julian said, his eyes searching hers, looking for a way back to the safety of the old world. What happens now, if there is no more teacher, and no more student? Elara took a step back, reclaiming her space, her own gravity. She picked up her bag, the heavy strap digging into her shoulder, a weight she carried, but one that was now entirely her own. Now, she said, walking toward the door, I go to the library. I'm going to finish my dissertation. I'm going to write the final chapter, and for the first time, Julian, I'm not going to care if you agree with my conclusion. I'm going to write it for myself. She paused at the door, a hand on the cold brass handle. She didn't look back, but she could feel him standing there in the center of his empire of paper, watching her go. And when I'm done, she added, her voice barely a whisper yet carrying the weight of an ultimatum. When the last page is turned and the degree is conferred, perhaps I'll come back. Not to this office, not to this desk, but to a place where we can speak without a syllabus between us. She opened the door and stepped out into the corridor. The stone floor rang with her footsteps, a sharp, clear sound that echoed through the cloisters. Each step was a liberation. She felt the heavy mantle of the student falling away, dissolving like salt in the damp English air. As she stepped out of the college gates and into the blurring rain of the high street, Elara Thorne didn't pull up her hood. She let the water soak into her hair, cold and real. Behind her, the spires of Greyfriars stood like silent sentinels of a dying age. Ahead of her, the city was a grey smudge of unknown possibilities. She had told him she didn't want to be his student anymore, and in doing so, she had finally graduated. Not with a scroll or a ceremony, but with the terrifying, beautiful realization that the only person who could truly define her mind was herself. The teacher had been left behind in the dust and the bergamot tea, and the woman walked on, alone and finally, spectacularly, unguided. The internal monologue that had once been a frantic rehearsal of his expected critique shifted. It became a symphony of her own observations, the way the puddles reflected the neon of the cinema sign, the way the wind rattled the iron railings of the park, the way her own heart beat a rhythm that belonged to no one but her. She thought of Julian, still standing by that window, perhaps for the first time in his life questioning the very architecture of his existence. She didn't pity him. She respected him enough to leave him with the truth. The hierarchy was dead. The classroom was empty, and as the bells of Christ Church began to toll for the evening service, Elara Thorne disappeared into the fog, a scholar of her own soul, answering to no one. The heavy oak doors of the Gladstone Library groaned as Elara pushed against them, a sound like a long-held breath, finally escaping the lungs of the building. Inside, the air was a different country, altogether stagnant, sweet with the scent of decaying leather and the dry, alkaline ghost of centuries-old ink. It was a cathedral of discarded thoughts, and for the first time, she did not feel like a supplicant. She felt like a trespasser who had suddenly realized she owned the land. She found her usual carrel in the north wing, a cramped wooden nook tucked beneath a leaded window that looked out over the grey, jagged teeth of the All Souls spires. Her coat, heavy with the English rain, wept onto the floorboards, the rhythmic drip-drop a metronome for the silence. She did not remove it. The cold was a necessary tether. It reminded her that her body was still hers, a solid thing distinct from the ethereal abstractions Julian Vane had spent years trying to weave into her mind. Julian. Even now, his name felt like a bruise in her consciousness, tender, purple and persistent. She could see him in the mind's eye, standing in that office on Tull Street, surrounded by his first editions and his curated shadows. He had always functioned as a mirror, reflecting back to her a version of herself that was perpetually unfinished, a rough draft that only his red ink could sanctify. How many hours had she spent trying to anticipate the curve of his smile or the specific, weary tilt of his head that signaled her failure to grasp a nuance. She opened her laptop, the glow of the screen a harsh, clinical intrusion against the amber dimness of the library. The cursor blinked a steady, demanding heartbeat. Right, it commanded. Define yourself. She looked at the title of her dissertation, The Architecture of Silence in Post-War Narrative. 4 months. It had been a dialogue with him. Every sentence had been a question posed to his imagined presence. Is this sophisticated enough, Julian? Does this echo your lecture on late modernism? Now, the words on the screen looked like shrapnel from a war. She was no longer fighting. She highlighted the last 3 paragraphs, the ones he had praised for their restraint, and pressed delete. The void that followed was not terrifying. It was spacious. He had wanted her to be an echo. He had coached her in the art of the intellectual sigh, the performative doubt that passed for wisdom in the cloisters of Greyfriars. But as she watched the rain lash against the stained glass, Elara realized that Julian was terrified of the very thing he taught. He studied the silence of others because he could not bear the noise of his own stagnation. He was a man who lived in the past tense, a curator of ghosts, and he had tried to turn her into one of his exhibits. Her fingers began to move, tentative at first, then with a frantic, percussive energy. She wasn't writing about silence anymore. She was writing about the scream beneath it. She was writing about the visceral, messy reality of being a woman in a space designed by men who preferred their muses to be made of marble and ink. I am not a vessel, she thought, the words a silent chant behind her teeth. I am the storm that breaks the vessel. The internal monologue that had once been a cacophony of his critiques began to dissolve. In its place, a new voice emerged, one that sounded remarkably like her own, stripped of the academic affectations and the borrowed prestige. She thought of the way Julian had looked when she told him she was leaving. There had been a moment of genuine, unadulterated fear in his eyes. Not fear for her, but fear for the vacuum she would leave behind. Without a student to mold, what was a teacher? Without a mirror to reflect his brilliance, was he merely a shadow in an empty room? The irony was a bitter draught. He had taught her to deconstruct everything: history, language, identity, but he had never expected her to deconstruct him. He had given her the tools for his own displacement. Hours bled into the evening. The library lights flickered, casting long, skeletal shadows across the rows of vellum-bound books. Elara's neck ached, and her eyes felt as though they had been scrubbed with sand. But the momentum was unstoppable. She was no longer just writing a thesis. She was excavating her own soul from the silt of his influence. Every word felt like a physical act of reclamation. She thought of the bergamot tea he always served, the steam rising in thin, mocking veils between them. She thought of the way he would lean back in his leather chair, steeple his fingers, and say, "Now, Elara, let us look at the subtext," as if the world were a puzzle only he held the key to. The subtext, she now saw, was power. It was the quiet, polite violence of a superior mind demanding total surrender. A shadow fell across her desk. She didn't jump. She didn't even look up, fearing for a second that the sheer force of her thoughts had summoned him there, a wraith in a tweed jacket. "Closing in 15 minutes, miss," a voice whispered. It was the porter, an elderly man named Arthur, who had walked these halls since before Julian had even been a fellow. Elara looked up, blinking against the fatigue. "Thank you, Arthur," she said, her voice sounding strange to her own ears, lower, steadier. "You've been at it a while," he noted, his eyes crinkling. "Found what you were looking for?" Elara looked at the screen. The word count had climbed, but more importantly, the tone had shifted. The prose was no longer a polite request for entry. It was a manifesto. "I found out I wasn't looking for anything," she said, beginning to pack her things. "I was just clearing the way." As she stepped back out into the night, the rain had tapered off into a fine, clinging mist that turned the street lamps into blurred halos of gold. The high street was nearly empty, the sound of a distant siren the only reminder of a world beyond the university's stone embrace. She walked toward the Cherwell, the river a black ribbon cutting through the heart of the city. She stood on the Magdalene Bridge, looking down at the dark water. The weight of the last 3 years felt like a physical burden. She was finally ready to drop. Julian Vane would receive her final draft in a few weeks. He would read it, and he would hate it. He would find it unruly, lacking in rigor, or perhaps dangerously subjective. And for the first time in her life, the thought brought her a profound, crystalline joy. His disapproval was no longer a wall. It was a signpost. It meant she was finally moving in the right direction. She reached into her pocket and found her phone. There was a notification, an email from him. She didn't need to open it to know what it said. It would be an apology wrapped in an instruction, a plea for her to return to the safety of the tutorial, to the comfort of the hierarchy. He would offer her a path back to being his student, a path back to the shadow. Elara didn't delete the email. She simply let it sit there, an unread relic of a finished chapter. She looked out at the spires of Oxford, those dreaming towers that had for so long felt like the boundaries of her universe. They looked smaller now. Beautiful, yes, but fragile. They were made of stone, and stone could crumble. She turned away from the college and began to walk toward the station. She wasn't going to a rented room in Jericho. She wasn't going back to the library. She was going to see the sun rise over a horizon that Julian Vane had never mapped. The teacher had taught her everything he knew, but the woman was about to learn everything he was too afraid to discover. The mist swallowed her silhouette as she moved, a solitary figure navigating the labyrinth of the old city, no longer a student following a light, but a fire burning of her own accord. The silence of the night was no longer his silence. It was her own, and it was deafeningly, gloriously full. The station platform was a cathedral of iron and glass, echoing with the ghostly whispers of departures long since concluded. Elara Thorne stood beneath the ticking clock, its rhythmic pulse a sharp contrast to the liquid silence of the Oxford night she had left behind. The air here was different, tainted with the sharp, industrial scent of diesel and the cold, metallic tang of the tracks, a world away from the dust of ancient vellum and the suffocating sweetness of Julian's bergamot tea. As the train pulled into the station, a great western beast hissing steam into the pre-dawn chill, Elara felt a strange, buoyant lightness. It was the vertigo of the unattached. For years, her gravity had been Julian Vane. His praise had been her oxygen, his critiques, the atmospheric pressure that kept her from dissolving. Now, stepping onto the carriage, she was entering a vacuum of her own making. She found a seat by the window, the fabric of the headrest smelling faintly of stale tobacco and travel. The carriage was nearly empty, a sanctuary for the restless and the fleeing. As the train lurched forward, the dreaming spires of the city began to slide away, obscured by the grey smudge of dawn. She watched them go, the Radcliffe camera, the skeletal arches of the schools, the window of the room where she had spent 1,000 hours trying to shrink herself into the shape of his expectations. She opened her laptop. The screen glowed, a cold, rectangular sun in the dimness of the compartment. There, in the sent folder, sat the manuscript. It was no longer a conversation with him. It was a monologue directed at the horizon. She had hit send as the train pulled out of the station, a final, digital severance. In her mind's eye, she saw him sitting in his study tomorrow morning. He would be wearing his charcoal cardigan, the one with the frayed cuff he refused to mend. He would take a sip of his tea, open his laptop, and see her name. He would expect a revision, a humble return to the fold, a document scrubbed of its unruly passion. Instead, he would find a text that dismantled his own theories with the clinical precision he had taught her, used against him like a blade forged in his own fire. He would call it a betrayal. She knew that. He would see it as a failure of his mentorship, a lapse in her intellectual discipline. But as the train picked up speed, carving through the damp Wiltshire countryside, Elara realized that Julian's greatest fear was never her failure. It was her autonomy. He didn't want a scholar. He wanted a mirror. He wanted a vessel that would reflect his own brilliance back at him, polished and refined. The sun began to bleed over the edge of the world, a thin line of bruised purple and gold. Elara leaned her forehead against the cold glass. The reflection of her own eyes stared back at her, no longer clouded by the frantic need to please. "I am not your student," she whispered, the words fogging the pain. She thought of the emails still sitting unread in her inbox. She finally opened it, not with a trembling heart, but with the detached curiosity of an archaeologist examining a relic of a dead civilization. "Elara," it began, "I fear our last session ended on a discordant note. You must understand that my rigor is born of a desire to see you reach the heights you are capable of. Come to the house this evening. We shall set aside the thesis for an hour and simply talk as equals." The lie of it was breathtaking. As equals. He had used that phrase as a tether for years, a promise of a future that would never arrive, because the hierarchy was the very foundation of his identity. To Julian, equality was a destination. He would always move further back the moment she drew near. She hit delete. The act was quiet, devoid of drama, yet it felt like the most significant thing she had ever done. The ghost of Julian Vane, the internalized critic who sat on her shoulder, correcting her syntax and questioning her impulses, seemed to dissipate with the flickering pixels. The train slowed as it approached the coast. The landscape had flattened, the claustrophobic beauty of the Cotswolds giving way to the vast, salt-scoured marshes of the estuary. The light here was broader, harsher, and infinitely more honest. When she stepped off the train at the end of the line, the air hit her with a violent, bracing cold. It tasted of salt and possibilities. She walked toward the sea wall, her boots crunching on the shingle. The tide was coming in, the grey Atlantic churning with a restless, indifferent power. She stood at the edge of the land, watching the white foam dissolve into the dark sand. Somewhere, back in a room filled with books and shadows, a man was waiting for a student who no longer existed. He would check his watch. He would grow impatient. He would wonder where his influence had gone wrong. But Elara Thorne was no longer looking back. She opened her notebook, a new one, its pages white and terrifyingly blank. She didn't write about the subtext of power or the displacement of the self. She wrote about the way the light hit the water, the way the wind felt like a slap of reality, and the way the silence of the coast was not an absence of sound, but the presence of her own voice, finally loud enough to be heard. The teacher had been left behind in the dust of the library. The woman stood on the shore, and for the first time in her life, she was the only one who knew what the next word would be. The rhythm of the train was a metronome for her life. She was finally out running, the constant clack-clack of the wheels against the steel rails sounding like the rapid, insistent heartbeat of a creature escaping its cage. Outside the window, the Wiltshire Downs had flattened into the sombre, waterlogged expanses of the Somerset levels, where the pollarded willows stood like hunched sentinels in the gathering gloom. Elara watched her reflection in the glass, a pale ghost superimposed over the rushing landscape. The woman in the window looked back with eyes that had spent too many years squinting at the margins of Julian Vane's handwritten notes, searching for a crumb of approval that was always, by design, just out of reach. She imagined him now, back in that room in Oxford, a room that smelled of old leather, stale tea, and the suffocating weight of centuries of patriarchal thought. By now, the evening shadows would be stretching across his mahogany desk, creeping over the stacks of monographs and the silver letter opener he used with surgical precision. He would be reaching for his laptop, perhaps wondering why she hadn't arrived for their scheduled talk. He would expect her to be standing on his doorstep, damp from the rain, clutching a revised chapter and 1,000 apologies. He would expect her to be the same Elara Thorne who had arrived at his door 3 years ago, malleable, hungry for the light of his intellect, and utterly convinced of her own insignificance. But that Elara was dead. She had been dismantled, word by word, in the manuscript she had sent from the station platform. The prose she had written was a violent departure from the measured tone he had spent years trying to beat into her. It was visceral. It was loud. It took his cherished theories on the phenomenology of silence and tore them open, revealing the void of ego that lay at their center. She had used his own dialectical methods to expose the fallacy of his control. It was not a student's submission. It was a sovereign's declaration of war. As the train pulled into the station at Highbridge, the screech of brakes felt like a physical release. She was the only passenger to alight. The platform was slick with a fine, misty rain that seemed to dissolve the edges of the world. The station master, a man named Arthur Penlegon, whose face was a map of deep, weathered creases, touched the brim of his cap as she passed. He didn't ask where she was going. In these coastal towns, people often arrived looking, as though they were searching for something the land had failed to provide. She began to walk. The town of Burnham-on-Sea was a quiet, unassuming huddle of Victorian brick and salt-stained render, its streets smelling of vinegar and wet asphalt. She avoided the main thoroughfare, choosing instead the narrow alleyways that smelled of the incoming tide. Her mind was a kaleidoscope of Julian's voice fragments of lectures, the way he would pause to polish his glasses when he wanted to signal his disappointment, the way he called her my dear with a patronizing affection that felt like a silken noose. You must learn to inhabit the silence, Elara, he had once told her, leaning back in his chair until the springs groaned. Your prose is too frantic. It lacks the gravitas of a truly disciplined mind. What he had meant, she realized now as she reached the concrete sweep of the sea wall, was that her prose was too much like her. It was alive. It was messy. It refused to be a monument to his greatness. He didn't want a scholar. He wanted an acolyte who would transcribe his genius into a more palatable, feminine key. He wanted her to be the footnote to his life's work. The wind hit her with the force of a physical blow as she ascended the steps to the promenade. The Bristol Channel lay before her, a vast, churning cauldron of grey and silt-brown water. The tide was high, the waves crashing against the sea wall with a rhythmic violence that made the very ground beneath her boots shudder. To the west, the lighthouse stood on its spindly wooden legs in the sand, a lonely, defiant structure facing the Atlantic. She leaned against the railing, her hands numbing in the biting air. This was the edge. There was no Julian here. There was no Oxford, no tenure-track anxieties, no rigor that was merely a euphemism for submission. There was only the roar of the water and the immense, terrifying freedom of being unobserved. She thought of the emails she had deleted. As equals, the phrase was a bitter joke. Julian Vane did not know how to exist in a world where he was not the sun around which all other planets orbited. To him, equality was a gift he could bestow, a carrot dangled at the end of a very long stick. He didn't realize that equality wasn't something granted. It was something seized. In her pocket, her phone vibrated. She didn't need to look at the screen to know who it was. He would have read the manuscript by now. He would be reeling from the cold, clinical way she had dismantled his legacy. He would be angry not because she was wrong, but because she was right, and because she had used his own tools to prove it. He would be calling to demand an explanation, to tell her she was being emotional, to pull her back into the orbit of his influence. She took the phone out. The screen glowed, a small, artificial light in the encroaching darkness. Julian Vane, incoming call. She didn't feel the tremor she expected. There was no spike of adrenaline, no reflexive urge to justify herself. Instead, she felt a profound, hollow stillness. She watched the phone ring until the screen went dark. Then she walked to the edge of the pier, where the water was deepest and the currents most treacherous. With a movement that was neither hurried nor dramatic, she dropped the device into the churning grey below. It vanished instantly, swallowed by the silt and the salt. The silence that followed was not the academic silence Julian had preached. It was the silence of a clean slate. She walked back toward the town, her steps lighter than they had been in years. She found a small, dimly lit guest house on the corner of Marine Drive, run by a woman named Mrs. Gable who smelled of lavender and floor wax. The room was small, with a lumpy bed and a window that rattled in its frame, but it was hers. It was a space unburdened by the weight of expectation. Elara sat at the small wooden desk by the window. She pulled the new notebook from her bag, the one she had bought at the station. Its cover a deep, unadorned blue. She picked up her pen, a simple black ink rollerball, far removed from the fountain pen Julian had gifted her for her first publication. She looked out at the dark horizon, where the line between the sea and the sky had been erased by the night. She thought of Julian, sitting in his study, surrounded by the ghosts of dead men, wondering why the mirror had finally shattered. He would spend the rest of his life trying to glue the pieces back together, trying to find a version of her that he could still control. He would never understand that the mirror hadn't broken. It had simply decided to stop being a mirror. She turned to the first page. The whiteness of it was not a void, but a beginning. It was the first time she had sat down to write, without the phantom of his disapproval looming over her shoulder. She didn't need his bibliography. She didn't need his approval. She didn't even need his language. She began to write, not of theories or abstractions, but of the salt on her skin and the way the wind felt like a shedding of old skin. She wrote about the lighthouse on the sand, and the way the tide always returns, relentless and indifferent to the structures of men. "I am here," she wrote, the ink blooming on the page, "and the world is wide." The teacher was a shadow in a room 5 hours away. The student was a memory. Elara Thorne closed her eyes for a moment, listening to the sea through the thin glass, And then she opened them, ready to write the next word, and the one after that, until the story was entirely her own.